Hello, I'm Richard Trudeau. I'm a semi-retired UU minister. At the moment, I'm the chair of the standing committee, which means the governing body of the Unitarian Church in Fall River, Massachusetts. And I'm the chair of the board of directors of the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council. I'm making this video in late November of 2022 because the Article 2 Study Commission has just proposed that we scrap the 7 principles, and I thought that perhaps before we do that, it might be good not only to think about what they say, but to think about where they came from. There's an email address there on the screen. If you'd like a copy of the script that I'm reading, I'd be happy to send it to you. Just send me an email, and within a day or two, I'll give you the script that I'm reading from. This is how the Unitarians were describing themselves right before their consolidation with the Universalists in 1961. Purposes and objectives of the AUA. Section 1. In accordance with its charter, the American Unitarian Association shall be devoted to moral, religious, educational, and charitable purposes. In accordance with these purposes, the American Unitarian Association shall, 1. Diffuse the knowledge and promote the interests of religion, which Jesus taught as love to God and love to man. 2. Strengthen the churches and fellowships which unite in the association for more and better work for the kingdom of God. 3. Organize new churches and fellowships for the extension of Unitarianism in our own countries and in other lands. And 4. Encourage sympathy and cooperation among religious liberals at home and abroad. Section 2. The association recognizes that its constituency is congregational in polity and that individual freedom of belief is inherent in the Unitarian tradition. Nothing in these purposes shall be construed as an authoritative test. One thing that strikes me is how little this says when you compare it to our current list of 7 principles, 6 sources, and more. The reason is that this statement was produced essentially in its present form in the 1890s, and it was produced at that time to heal a schism. It's an anti-schismatic statement. It wants to set a bar that's very low, making a tent as big as possible to include all of the factions. Let me tell you about the schism. When the original American Unitarian Association was formed in 1825, it was an organization of individuals, not congregations. It did not correspond to the UUA. It was something like UUs for a Just Economic Community, or UUs for Jewish Awareness, or another of those many groups we have today. The Unitarians did not have an organization of congregations until 1865, when they formed the National Conference of Unitarian and Other Christian Churches. It's clear from that name that the majority of Unitarians thought of themselves as a kind of Christian. Of course, other religious people thought of them as heretics, but they thought of themselves as a kind of Christian. But there were, in the middle of the 19th century, people further to the left, people we would today call humanists, though that term wasn't used then. And there were humanist congregations. And just 2 years after the formation of the National Conference, about 24 congregations seceded and formed the Free Religious Association. And this schism lasted for a quarter century. The schism ended in the early 1890s when the three Unitarian organizations, the AUA, the National Conference, and the Free Religious Association, combined into a single organization of congregations. Individual membership was phased out, and the combined organization took the name of the oldest, the American Unitarian Association. So beginning in the 1890s, the AUA became an organization of congregations, and it adopted in substance the statement that I showed you, which was still being used in 1959. The Christian majority among the Unitarians were mollified because of the reference to Jesus and to God in point number 1, and because of the reference to the kingdom of God in point number 2. And the humanists were mollified too. Reading closely, they could see that the term religion in one was really undefined, with Jesus' definition offered as only an example that didn't require them to accept Christian ideas. Religion, which Jesus taught as love to God and love to man. And they could accept the mention of kingdom of God in 2, because by the 1890s there were some biblical scholars who were saying that on Jesus' lips that expression referred not to an afterlife or anything supernatural, but to a vision that Jesus had of what this world could be like if there were peace and justice and enough to go around. Another thing that strikes me about the 1959 Unitarian statement is that it makes no mention of what I want to call the Unitarian taproot. That is the original religious concern of American Unitarians. The Unitarian taproot was salvation by character. Let me tell you about that. The European Unitarians in general, and the English Unitarians in particular, were not, in my opinion, so much our religious ancestors as they were our religious cousins. For the English Unitarians, the central concern was to deny the doctrine of the Trinity, making the name Unitarian very appropriate. But the religious liberals who, beginning around 1800, emerged from the Puritan heritage churches in New England, they were named by their opponents, and their opponents said, "Oh, you people are just like those Unitarians," referring to the group in England. The American liberals accepted this name because they did have doubts about the Trinity, but their central concern was not to deny the Trinity, but to deny predestination, the Calvinist doctrine which says that before we're born, God has already decided whether we're going to heaven or hell, and there's nothing we can do to change God's decision. The American Unitarians said in effect, "Oh, that's so unfair. We don't believe in a God like that, a tyrant whose whim seals a person's fate for all eternity. We believe that each person has the power to earn their own salvation by living a life of high moral character." And the Unitarians summarized this line of thought in their slogan, salvation by character. Not God is one, salvation by character. It's not surprising there's no mention of salvation by character in the Unitarian statement, because the term salvation would have been radioactive to humanists, and of course they were trying to be inclusive of humanists and Christians. And though I think the Unitarians could have included much of the substance of their taproot, salvation by character, in other language that would have been acceptable to everyone, for example, the dignity of each individual, the fact is that they did not do so. Here is how the Universalists were describing themselves right before their consolidation with the Unitarians in 1961. The numbers are mine. They said, "We avow our faith in God as eternal and all-conquering love, the spiritual leadership of Jesus, the supreme worth of every human personality, the authority of truth, known or to be known, and the power of men of goodwill and sacrificial spirit to overcome all evil and progressively establish the kingdom of God. Neither this nor any other statement shall be imposed as a creedal test." This is another anti-schismatic statement. Universalists were also challenged by humanists, not so much in the 19th century, but early in the 20th, by which time the term humanist had come into use. There was no schism in the early 20th century, but Universalists had experienced one back in the 1830s, and they had no taste for another. Plus, they saw what had happened to the Unitarians more recently. Many of the Universalist leaders appreciated what humanists were saying, but at the same time, they felt that Universalism had spent 150 years developing a very liberal form of Christianity, and they didn't want to give that up. The resulting statement, which you see here, is a synthesis of liberal Christianity and humanism. Points 1, 2, and 5, God as eternal and all-conquering love, the spiritual leadership of Jesus, the power of men of goodwill and sacrificial spirit to overcome all evil and progressively establish the kingdom of God, those 3 points proclaim liberal Christianity. While points 3, 4, and 6, the supreme worth of every human personality, the authority of truth, known or to be known, and neither this nor any other statement shall be imposed as a creedal test, those points are humanistic. The majority of Universalists saw themselves as a kind of Christian and were satisfied by the references to God and Jesus and the kingdom of God. Humanists were satisfied too. Looking at one, they thought, if what is meant by God is love, there's no problem, for love certainly exists. Looking at 2, they agreed that the man Jesus was certainly a spiritual leader and worthy of respect, and looking at 5, they understood the kingdom of God to be Jesus' vision of how this world could become if there were peace and justice and enough to go around. The Universalists were more successful than the Unitarians had been at including a version of their taproot in this statement. Their central concern was, of course, to proclaim universal salvation. That's where they got their name. Universal salvation meant everybody goes to heaven. God somehow finds a way to save everybody, even Hitler. No one goes to hell. They couldn't say no one goes to hell if they wanted to include humanists, but they could say something very close, and this is their point 3, which the supreme worth of every human personality, which says, in effect, no one deserves hell. In 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists got married, and they produced this description of their union. So this is the first set of UUA principles. The underlining is mine. Principles and purposes of the UUA. The members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, dedicated to the principles of a free faith, unite in seeking, 1, to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship. 2, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. 3, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. 4, to implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace. 5, to serve the needs of member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberal religion. 6, to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. Our current principles and purposes, or principles, date to 1985, when this was revised, and the revision of this was motivated in part by a desire to remove the gendered language, which I'm sure you've noticed. Another motive was to add a principle that would express concern for the environment, and my understanding is that it was the Reverend Paul LaRue who suggested the wording of our resulting 7th principle. The first part of number 2, before the comma, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, is an innovation. Both the Unitarians and the Universalists had been investigating world religions since at least the 1820s, but they had never said so in an official statement. At last, this practice was acknowledged here. In the current list of UU principles, number 2 has been removed from the list of principles and expanded into the list of sources. This is where the list of sources came from. It was the Reverend Harry Haler of the UU congregation in Weston, Massachusetts, who suggested doing so. Though he was a Christian himself, he saw that continuing to single out the Judeo-Christian tradition in the list of principles would cause needless controversy. Note the phrase free faith there at the beginning, and note also the phrase liberal religion here at the end of number 5. In 1961, those phrases were well understood to mean what one of my seminary professors meant when he said that Unitarianism and Universalism were, quote, religious manifestations of the Enlightenment. Religious manifestations of the Enlightenment, end quote. UUism is the result of applying Enlightenment values like reason, evidence, free expression, the right of conscience, and democracy to religion. In 1, the free and disciplined search for truth has become our current 4th principle, which says a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Much has been made lately of the word responsible being substituted for the word disciplined. In the 1961 statement, discipline meant intellectually rigorous. Some have suggested to me that the change to responsible in 1985 reflected an attempt to introduce an ethical dimension. This may be so, but I'm sure that there was no thought whatever in 1985, as some are asserting today, that responsible implies that one's search for truth should be pursued with an eye to the wishes or the feelings of outside observers. The language at the beginning of 3, affirm and promote, is used today at the beginning of our current 7 principles. I've underlined the 3 parts of number 3 that come afterward. The first, the supreme worth of every human personality, has been lifted directly from the 1953 Universalist statement, and it expresses in humanist language the Universalist taproot. The second underlined item in number 3, the dignity of man, expresses in humanist language the Unitarian taproot, salvation by character, or at least something very close to that. Our current first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, has combined these two, making our first principle a concise statement of simultaneously the most important part of the Unitarian heritage and the most important part of the Universalist heritage. Our current fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, derives from the last thing I underlined in number 3, together with the right of conscience that is implied by the phrases free faith and liberal religion, as I mentioned before. Here are our current principles, unchanged since 1985. Later revisions have been confined to the sources and guarantees of non-discrimination. I have added the numbers and the underlining. Principles of the UUA. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person; 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations; 3, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations; 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning; 5, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large; 6, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all; and 7, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. The things I've underlined are things that have been attacked by national UU officials at the UUA and in the UU Ministers Association and in the leadership of both our seminaries over the last 10 years or so. They have attacked the inherent worth and dignity of every person, saying that should be decentered. They have attacked by their behavior acceptance of one another. They have attacked by their behavior a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. They have attacked by their behavior the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. And of course now, by the Article 2 Study Commission is attacking the whole list of 7, recommending that they be removed altogether. Thank you for listening.